Okay, recording. Maybe it's a good idea to have some brief presentations because there are some new people, for me, new uh, Roland. I live in and work in Belgium, and I'm a journalist at a local business newspaper. I attended various courses, online courses, and real-life presentations by Howard Rheingold. I got involved with the Peeragogy Handbook right at the start, and I try to convene people in order to read books together. And so one of the books the last book we have been reading before this project was The Virtual Community by Howard also. And, and then we thought, well, maybe it's a good idea to have a look at the Peeragogy Handbook, because it's very much in the same, it's a kind of a learning community, of course. And so that's what we have been doing now, and we hope to contribute to the fourth iteration. And that's about it. Maybe you can something about yourself.
I'll go. Hi, my name is Griff. I'm the director at Peer-to-Peer University. I live in Boston. And yeah, I've been speaking with Joe and Charlie and Charlotte now for about a month about contributing to V4 of the handbook. We have a lot of documentation at my organization about learning circles and sort of different peer-to-peer facilitation strategies. And so what I said I would do was both identify some parts of the current hand. I basically go through V3 now, so I can identify some parts that are very interesting for me. And then we can propose a few sections that we might want to contribute to for V4. And this was one of the sections of the handbook that I found most interesting and was excited to read through. My partner also just attended PLOP in Ottawa, the Pattern Language Programs conference, and really liked it a lot. And so I'm very familiar with Christopher Alexander's work, so I was excited to think about it in the context of peer learning.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Lauren. So what's your...
Hello. I'm super happy to be here tonight. Robert, it's nice seeing you. And Roland, we met a couple times before. I don't know if you remember. Yes. Stefan, it's nice to have you on the call. Of course, Charles. And I'm sorry, I gotta go. My kids are doing something, so carry on. Sorry.
Oh, Stefan. We see a black screen with the name. Or else, Charles.
Mouth a little full of food. Well, I'm just glad to be here. I'm really into this in a lot of ways, from a lot of angles. I don't know what to say. I mean, there's just a lot. I don't want to make a laundry list now, but I think since I'm trying to have dinner, I've been on a series of other calls today, and I had barely a break between. It's one of those days. I've also been in a deep dive in the last, well, more and more in the last year, but also the last few years into pattern languages in particular, some of you know, I've been working with Tom Atlee and the Wise Democracy Project, Wise Democracy Pattern Language. So through him and through that experience and through that tool set, I've kind of got really deep into pattern languages and realized as my learning journey has gone on, especially in the last year, that pattern languages are sort of all around. Sometimes they're articulated as such or not. So I kind of began to see more and more through the lens of pattern languages and patterns everywhere. And maybe just because I sort of made post-it to self, I wanted to give a shout to the I Ching, which I consider potentially the original pattern language. So maybe that's useful or not. That's me.
Okay. Robert.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, hopefully there's not a lot of background noise. Yeah, so I don't know how to describe myself that well. I'm sort of in a transitionary period and more of a generalist sort of, or maybe it would be called jack of all trades, which paired with means I'm sort of a master of none. So I sort of explored things like pattern language a little bit. I'm also really interested in sort of both self-directed learning, but also, yeah, how to do that in sort of a peer-to-peer context so that it's not just sort of me doing it on my own, and also how that overlaps with technology. So I've worked on and been interested in the sort of P2P D-Web space as well. So that's kind of another facet to the peer-to-peer element to this. And yeah, so I recognize a bunch of people on this call because I've sort of been kicking around this idea of sort of like online peer learning community stuff, whether it's through reading groups like Roland's been obviously posting for us, and yeah, thinking about how to use different maybe open source technologies and things like that to help facilitators create sort of online peer learning spaces. I don't know, I guess that's good enough now. I'll stop there.
Pretty sure that knows about you can still a little bit of your current. Oh, it seems that
we didn't quite hear you. What did you say?
Yeah, Joseph. I just maybe you could everyone guess, but maybe
Okay.
Your,
so
projects.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'm one of the co-authors of this sections that we're going to look at today. So you can learn something about me from reading these sections, but they were written with Charlie Danoff and Charlotte, particularly, who are not here, and several other co-authors. Paula did the one that if we get to at the end. I don't know if we'll have time, but Paula wrote that one, if I remember correctly. What Robert just said, I resonate with those experiences, but maybe as of today, most recently, I was looking at some of the stuff we wrote way back in 2012, thinking about how to get funding for the Peeragogy project. We'd actually put in a funding application to the Knight Foundation, which we didn't get funded. And then we had thought about rebooting it as a Kickstarter project, which we never did that for whatever reason. So some of that was fresh on my mind, just thinking, gosh, this proposal we wrote back in 2012 wasn't so bad. And the Kickstarter idea, we never tried that. Maybe we should do that. So that was some of the stuff I was looking at today. But yeah, I'm really into peer learning, and one of the kind of weird things maybe is I'm interested in peer learning even for computers as a kind of agent-based model approach to machine learning. So that's something I've been looking at over the last couple of months, trying to develop another proposal in that space, which I have sent off. So yeah, so I'm interested in everything everyone said here, and I've been taking detailed notes. I hope that's okay. Generally, one of the things in this project is, when people come to these meetings, we generally take notes and it would be ideal to get your permission to include them in the handbook and have you be contributors to the handbook, but no pressure. We won't do it without your permission, but I probably will take notes on the meeting and try to be muted when I'm doing that because, yes, as people have observed, I've got a clicky keyboard. So leave it at that.
Thank you for taking notes. I know you do that extremely fast and precise. Hi, Lauren. How are you? Everything all right back there?
I'm good.
So, what are Lauren? What are your current interests regarding pattern language, peer-to-peer learning, and stuff like that?
So I actually had a really great conversation the other day with a guy named Dill Green. He's in London, and he's been in pattern language for a while. And he's, I don't know, I guess he's exploring some stuff with David Atkinson, who also is interested in exploring pattern language. So that just kind of reinvigorated my my desire for to kind of be involved in the space. And,
okay.
oh yeah.
So, yeah. So maybe let's just start. And one of the chapters or the sections of the chapter, I guess, today is about practice. And I just to go through the pages of the handbook, and we just rim on that, we react on that, and see where we get. I can share the screen, I guess. Try. So these are the, okay, that's already one chapter further, I think. Practice. Okay, let's start here maybe. The first part of it is about institutions, pedagogy inside and outside of institutions, even though it is stated from the beginning that pedagogy is for any group of people who want to learn anything. And then there's this picture of the prototypical university, Wisconsin State University. Some nice pictures in this book. And so there is this historical conception of a university, assuming leadership in the application for the direct improvement of the people in every sector. The familiar also for relative knowledge, but it's not the only model available. Then there is a contrast with our current era of Wikipedia, stock exchange, and free libre open source software development. And the big question, what might an accredited free libre open university like, and how would it contrast with the typical image of a university from like we just saw on the picture? Would we have a dormitory, a library, a science hall, and so on? What would the roles be? And that's of course a very good question. And one of my first questions is, do we absolutely want this open university to be accredited? What's the importance of being accredited?
It would be awesome to hear Griff's reflections on that, because they're probably the closest to having a university. It's right in their name, P2PU. If I remember correctly, I was just reflecting on this today. Maybe some of the very early discussions at P2PU were indeed talking about that, just this question that Roland raised, but I don't know if it's part of the current conversation. And maybe Griff, could you sum up some of that history?
Sure. Right now, and for the foreseeable future, P2P will definitely not be seeking any type of accreditation. That is not because we necessarily discount it as being valuable. I think our opinion right now is that, at least in the United States, but I think I can speak for other places as well, the structured formalities that you have to go through in order to become accredited take the work so far in a particular direction as to render the work that we're doing, I think, not possible. I think there's a guy, someone I know, Adam Bush in Rhode Island, who's gone through 6 years of accreditation on College Unbound, which I think is the best instance of an organization that embodies these sorts of principles, that has gone down the accreditation route. And I think he's someone who you may want to reach out to. I could point you in his direction if you want the perspective of someone who has gone down the route of accreditation. But I think just taking a perspective of, who are you trying to serve and why is probably, I mean, for us, that is the starting point. And, given that most of our work is with public libraries and existing at the margins of formal education, it would not make sense for us to compete with those institutions. So I think that for me and for P2PU, I think peer learning exists as a sort of alternate form of learning in society that sits alongside a lot of the bigger institutions. And if we can be creating more sort of empowering spaces for people to operate on their own terms, whether they are coming from formal education or going into formal education, and we just want to help them do what they want to do. So we do have some partnerships with like the Linux Professional Institute, which does professional certification. And so I think we're not naive in thinking that certification and accreditation. But I think if there's one thing that we're trying to do at P2PU, it's to help people articulate what their goals are, how they want success to be conferred in service of whatever it is that they're trying to do, rather than creating this sort of you either have it or you don't have it, scarcity-based accreditation module. So I think that probably could have articulated those thoughts in a more coherent order, but I hope that's useful as a starting point, Joe.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. I mean, I think that was, you didn't repeat yourself. You covered a lot of stuff. I thought it was a nice summary. Thank you. And very clear. And so I don't quite remember what it says here in this document, but I suppose if I would just say some of my inspirations might be things like Bennington College, which is a private college where people can somehow, get credit for, doing some community-oriented projects and things like that. Now, again, yeah, that if we're sort of saying that's something very different from P2PU, that makes loads of sense. They're quite different, but there is a certain intersection as well. So maybe relevant to today's conversation and this question Roland raised, we shouldn't take the whole time to discuss it. If other people have other things they want to say now, we could go on that, but I think Roland's question would be a good question to return to, like, yeah, what are the advantages? Mm-hmm. What are the ways, you could imagine someone who is a Bennington student coming and working with P2PU, for example, and maybe the opposite in reverse. So there may be good ways to have interactions between, but yeah, to what end? I think that was a really good point. I liked what you said at the end there. that people can decide their own format for success. And that, yeah, that could include accreditation or have nothing to do with accreditation. So that's awesome.
Sorry.
Just to add, you know, I'm sitting here in Switzerland, and you know, like a lot of places, there's a lot of emphasis on paper. I remember this movie, The Paper Chase. Well, you know, so I mean, that's sort of not exactly what we're talking about, but maybe it's maybe what's not been said here is sort of taking that accreditation and working with it. You know, actually getting paid. You know, if not actually. You know, on the basis of it as a component of having income, and I think that's a valuable conversation, and it's something I'm also interested in. I mean, not that, you know, I'm still, let's say, at the beginning of my going through the material and you know, deserving that, but I think that's behind this this thread here.
Yeah, it was also, as a journalist, I was thinking about issues such as fake news and fake information. Maybe accreditation can also be a kind of a defense against bogus institutions offering, I don't know, maybe you could imagine that there's a peer-to-peer learning of anti-vaxxers and that they just exchange their kind of fake information. And give that a kind of pseudo institutional or learned image by calling it, well, we are pedagogues, you know, and we are finding all kinds of interesting patterns here, while what they are doing would be just more crap information. And maybe accreditation could be a kind of a safeguard against that, or am I being too naive here?
Well, this has come up, I mean, in the case of US politics, it's come up in terms of Facebook and political news. So for example, you know, on the radio, you can't broadcast fake information, false information in political ads, but on Facebook you can. So I guess what's the go-to place if you want to broadcast false information? Facebook would be great for that. It's conceivable, but on the other hand, I suppose we could have, without pursuing formal accreditation, we could have things like our own peer review models and other such internal structures to build that quality in rather than have it come from without. And I think that would be maybe closer to what P2PU does, and certainly closer to what I would like to do with Peeragogy, because yeah, it's not really about provision. That's the other weird thing about Peeragogy, is it's not really about provisionism, providing somebody with a great place to learn, because we all build that together. So we're co-participating in it. So absolutely, you could have Peeragogy for anti-vax or any other kind of ideology, and to be objective, that's okay. I'm comfortable with that. But maybe we would look at the ways in which those people are also failing to learn certain things as well. We
could kind of covertly sort of, you know, insert our values. Okay, I'll stop there.
I think also, yeah, I think Joe, maybe you're getting at this point. There's a, you know, accreditation, or just sort of, you know, yeah, accreditation connote, you know, ostensibly it's because it's a way to sort of connote competencies that have been gained, but it ends up also serving then as a gate. And I think that, you know, looking through V3 of the handbook, you know, I think there's a section on assessment at the end.
Yes.
And I sort of liked I liked the idea that there wasn't this big talk of accreditation up front as much, and that we were just sort of getting into the learning, because, you know, I think that there's certainly value in the sort of demonstrated, you know, being able to demonstrate that you have a certain competency or demonstrate that you took part in a particular thing. And I think, you know, Joe, like you were just saying, to be able to do that in a way that doesn't come at the expense of entry and doesn't create this wall where then all of a sudden you're creating education that is valued based on like scarcity, like I was saying earlier. I think it's important in that case to think of assessment / accreditation as sort of something that, is sort of comes with the things that you've learned, rather than as something that you automatically get just by showing up on the first day, as is the case with higher education.
Yeah, fantastic. And that really fits with what you were saying before about people picking their own ways to do that. And we've done that all the time in the Peeragogy project. So this is a good example. We wanted to write about patterns, I guess, and we thought, well, how can we do that? Well, let's write a paper for a patterns conference. You know what I mean? And so there is, again, a kind of gatekeeping, like they didn't let in every single paper, but it's a gate that we chose to go through, and it's a kind of credit, if you will, that we earned, and we chose it. So it's a different kind of gate from one that you were forced to go through, and maybe some people don't even really regard it as a credential at all. So so I think we're on the same page here. I was just trying to think, could we relate this issue of accreditation back to this basic question of patterns? And maybe we should hold that thought. I mean, one thing that occurs to me about patterns is, the basic form of patterns is like problem, solution, and rationale. At least that's my current understanding of them. And then there's the more complex framework here. But, one of the issues there would be, how do you know, if you have a solution, how do you know it's a solution? And even beyond that, if you have a solution and you know it's a solution, how do you know it's a good solution? So I do think that this issue of quality control around solutions is important for pattern languages. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go get the stamp of approval of Plop or Christopher Alexander or something for your patterns. But it is an interesting question, which is, where do we get these quality assurance things from?
So your description of the design pattern as a solution, first of all, a commonly occurring problem, then the solution and the rationale for choosing the solution. This seems to be like a kind of a basic skeleton for what constitutes a design pattern. At the same time, there's also references being made to previous pattern languages about similar topics, and I must admit I did not really consult the footnotes about liberating voices, pedagogical patterns, and learning patterns. There seems to be some difference with those other forms, and in the text it is being said that the innovation is simply to add a what's next annotation, which anticipates the way the pattern will continue to resolve. But I don't know whether it is useful to have some more information about those other pattern languages. Are they very different from what we are doing here, or?
No, they're not really. They're quite similar, in my own opinion. There was someone here who's working with current patterns activities. Who was that? Someone, Wise Democracy, Charles. So I don't know, Charles, maybe you'd be a better qualified to say, is this really different from what you do in the Wise Democracy project?
I missed the beginning of the question. Sorry, could you repeat?
So the question was just like, how similar is this to other pattern language projects? And yeah, maybe others would be more qualified to rule on that. But I would say it's quite similar.
Peeragogy as a pattern language, you mean?
Yeah, well, this particular, the template and our approach to patterns here, yeah.
I'm not sure. I was actually a little distracted considering I didn't quite make the connection between, like, for me, patterns, I like this idea, and I've been looking at that recently this week, the solving problems aspect of design patterns. And that makes sense to me. Before that, I see them as things to observe. Patterns are observable. It's a little more abstract maybe, or less practical. But so I was just wondering, maybe I'm just missing something obvious, but what's the bridge between sort of observing patterns and then getting to the application of them? So anyway, that's why I was not kind of hearing the question. But I don't have a better answer anyway, sorry.
So there were other people who have other experiences with pattern languages as well. Lauren, Griff.
By the way, Stefan had some issues with audio and other tech things, so unfortunately, even though he probably has a lot to say, he's not able to at the moment.
Okay, if you can do it by chat, we'll get the chat at least later, Stefan. So, but
he's not hearing the audio either, actually.
He can't even hear the audio. Okay, so maybe someone has to relay everything to him by chat. That's not easy. So, right. So we'll get a recording though. Well, we can discuss it more next time. It should be similar, I guess, based on your point about observing things. There should be a lot of similarities because we're talking about patterns. So there's the pattern, right? Which isn't in this particular paper, but yeah.
I feel kind of answered. Sorry to interrupt. Just to say, the word design, I think, is key to this problem solution thing. Like designing what, some kind of system or framework or whatever. So then that comes into play.
Yeah. So this is the template of the pattern. It's a problem, the solution, the rationale, and then the resolution of the forces. And named in bold, it says. Let's have a look. Then you have this graphic also, which is above, I think, or maybe that was another page. But it looks very simple. If you look at the pattern template, it's a neat way to look at the world. Of course, you look at these, but there are some concepts which are a bit more complicated, maybe like the forces that operate within the context of an application. But there we will get quite some examples explaining what that would mean in practice.
Yeah, something I guess I understand better now than I did in 2015 is that these forces and the problem, it's kind of obvious, but that's meant to represent a kind of conflict. So like a recurring conflict. So you basically, relevant to what Charles was just saying, you observe a recurring conflict. So let's take this issue of how do we get credit for things that we did, or how do we make sure the news we're absorbing is correct. So we notice that there are certain cases where there's a problem in that regard, and then we notice that there are certain solutions that people frequently use. So that's a little different, I guess, from what Charles was saying, but I think that's close to what Christopher Alexander was saying, is that the forces are always in his patterns, the forces are always in conflict. If there wasn't a conflict, there would be no need to do design. So that's Christopher Alexander's idea of design, is ways to resolve conflicts, basically.
Then you have this this graph of the connections between the patterns of pedagogy, assess, cooperate, convene, the scrapbook, with lots of arrows going seemingly everywhere.
Somewhat useless diagram in that regard. I think we talked in one of the earlier sessions actually about this diagram 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
We were talking about making it more like a landscape, because all these arrows don't really mean anything. I think if we were talking about maybe what's the boundary of this space, so there could be a more interesting graphical way to display this information.
Well, it makes more sense once you go through the next 2 pages, of course, and then return to the graph. Then it makes more sense. Why, when it's at right at the start of it, before even people really know what heartbeat is, for instance, or carrying capacity, it's a bit enigmatic and intimidating. But well, maybe it's not too bad to have it here and just have people come back and have a look at it. And then here it is explained immediately after the graph. You'll see what is the pattern catalog of pedagogy roadmap, the reduce, reuse, and recycle, the carrying capacity, the specific project, the wrapper, and heartbeat, newcomer, and scrapbook patterns. So I think this makes sense, of course. And the next 2 pages are discussing all these patterns more in depth and following the same template.
This is Griff. Looking through it, I like the sort of common framework for each section. I felt like there was a few times when it seemed a bit meta, just using peeragogy as the example, and I think that sort of documentation of we're doing what we're talking about, and this is a constantly evolving practice is great. I felt when I was reading through it that I would have liked to have seen a few other examples from other organizations, because I just think that sometimes it's I feel like we could be a bit more concrete in certain areas, and I mean, so we're happy to provide some case studies to some of these things, but yeah, I think that showing how pedagogy is sort of embodying these patterns is, definitely keep doing that. And then I think just thinking about a few places where it might be strategic to sort of insert some other case studies that allow people to sort of make the connection between a few different projects or a few different examples. I think that will help clarify a few of the things.
Awesome. So I'm making a comment right there, tagging you. I mean, I completely agree. I certainly don't think, starting with peeragogy as a pattern is a great thing. It's nice to kind of sum things up, but in effect, this one could almost be, we write it and burn it. I think this was just a scaffolding one. So, but it could be fun to talk about it, but we should completely take that comment on board. And I think that comment has come up every week. I think that's it's certainly true about this project that we've tried to use it as a way to reflect on things, but it's also true that we have not been sufficiently outward looking. So if we went and looked at peer learning among anti-vaxxers or something like that, that could be interesting. And then only when people say, yeah, but how are you qualified to talk about this? Only then can we say, hey, look, we've actually done a lot of the introspection. So those comments are welcome, and we need more, not just case studies, but also kind of even more critical voices. Because again, who are we to criticize, really? I think that if we built even other patterns that are coming in from other contexts, which we don't use here, but document them or something, I mean, that would be nice to start rather with this pattern, but rather than starting with this pattern, we could sort of say, let's have a quick look at peeragogy and pattern languages elsewhere, so that it's not always about us. And that that's come up so many times in the previous conversations. It hardly bears repeating. It more bears like deleting. So we need to go through the book and adjust that. But yeah, point well taken.
Reading through the pedagogy pattern, I had this from my own subjective point of view, of course. I was fascinated by this reference to postmodern organizations, the friendly competition, etc. And it really reminded me that it would be so nice to have in the Peeragogy Handbook a chapter about business models or patterns, about how do you want to finance it? Do you need to finance it? If you want to find the resources to do something, more than just time, also money, for instance, then well, what are the patterns to get there, to 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 collect the money for people, and because of course Wikipedia is a very nice example. It's a fantastic thing. It's a kind of achievement of humanity to have this. At the same time, you could easily, and that's also what happened, of course, put out of business the classical encyclopedias, but also the people who once earned their living working and writing and editing encyclopedias, because all of a sudden you have people who are doing this in their spare time, being financed by other means, by just doing it as a kind of a very serious hobby, and they manage to create something which is at least as good as these other encyclopedias. But at the same time, you see what's coming up. Of course, you are maybe destroying complete professions. You could imagine to have a peer-to-peer newspaper and put out of a job all the professional journalists, and that's what we keep, and or just maybe not all of them, but having a skeleton crew of journalists, and then having lots of people working for free because they like to do this. So there is this idea of the business patterns behind it. Also had this question about inclusiveness and specificity being intention. Maybe we could explain that a bit more. I can. There is a sudden silence. I don't know whether it's my computer and connection, or whether we're all reading.
The silence, I think, was you. Maybe you were in the middle of saying something, but yeah, your computer stopped you from saying everything. So
Okay,
about specificity and
yes, it may be that we should explain that a bit more. The tension
where is
between.
that?
Well, that's when you go back to the to here to the pedagogy pattern. I think you're still yes.
This threshold.
You have the forces,
Yeah.
and then you have inclusiveness and specificity.
Right. Okay. So I mean, in a way, this is similar to what we were just talking about with Griff, that we sort of say, what does it mean to be a pattern? Does it mean that, it happened one time in the Peeragogy project? No. Does it happen in every single project? No. Well, you don't require that either. So if you're very specific and just say, okay, well, this is what we did in the Peeragogy project, that's actually not that interesting, and not that many people will respond to that. If we're inclusive and we have a lot of sort of generalities, that's good. But it's only really very good if it's also backed up with concrete examples to say, well, look, here's how it works at P2PU, here's how it works in the Wikimedia Foundation. So it's a productive tension, I guess, between those. But yeah, that statement itself is pretty vague.
And then the next pattern is pretty concrete, I think, the roadmap pattern. How your group can define the scope of the project and make a realistic plan to address it. It's even said that it provides the backbone of our pattern language. can be used to find a shared goal.
Although this one's rather indeed a very general pattern, it doesn't have the same, it doesn't have quite so much of the same weird recursive loops. I mean, all of these patterns have a bit of a recursive loop. If you look at this what's next step at the end, where we're talking about what's next for our project. But yeah, and so the roadmap, the idea of all these patterns, I guess, is that the roadmap will be built out of those what's next steps. And that's a somewhat unique take on patterns. That's the different thing that we were saying about other people might have pattern languages, but this particular part hadn't come up before. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the pattern couldn't be useful for others. So, you know, other people might say, oh yes, we want this pattern, and we will have our own what's next step. So
yes,
so we could also document some of those other what's next steps. It's the what next step is not unique to this project. It just happens to be instantiated that way somehow.
That kind of reminds me of what we talked about last time in regard to different introductions as well for different groups. So
yeah, that's a great callback. Thank you.
Makes me think that the easy part of reading groups is that your roadmap can simply be the content table of a book. It makes a very obvious backbone of what you're going to do. You say, well, you have 10 chapters and we have 10 weeks, and we'll do 1 chapter each week, which is the most simple roadmap imaginable.
And just to fill in slightly for those who weren't there last week, I mean, yeah, so there are already ideas for variations on introductions for different target groups or audiences with different purposes and missions and so forth. And so, yeah, by the same token, then, you know, there could be variations in next steps. Yeah, and I think we also actually even got into the idea of printing these different versions with different sequences and so forth.
But that's something which is relatively easy to implement for online, I guess. It's a bit more tricky to do it for a print publication, to have different introductions for different groups.
Well, yeah, and again, to refresh from last time, there was the idea of the printing on demand option, so maybe it wouldn't be so hard.
Yeah.
Another thing we talked about last time was the idea of wikis as pattern languages, and maybe vice versa. So, you know, we could easily imagine a core pattern, and then, you know, a specific project in their own wiki could have their own what's next step if they wanted to use this kind of style. So yeah, it could be quite fun to make a version of the handbook that was sitting inside of one of these federated wikis, or even just a version of this pattern language sitting inside of one of the federated wikis. Oh, it looks like Howard's here.
Hi, Howard. Well, that makes us...
Checking in.
Hi there.
Hello, Howard. We're deep into patterns, all kinds of patterns. For instance, reduce, reuse, and recycle. We're recycling stuff right now. Here you see you don't have to do everything yourself. Resources are useful only when you can make sense of them. It's another force, and your understanding gains robustness when you share with others. And that's the reinventing the wheel syndrome. And Duchamp. And therefore, we use the pedagogy project as a kind of a paradigm or a kind of an example to explain each pattern I see, how we use the off-the-shelf and hosted software like Drupal and Google, which no longer Google Plus no longer in existence, WordPress happily still in existence, share LaTeX, stuff like that.
I see you've got a pretty good group here.
Yeah, it's a quite thrilling actually. So I think most of them would be ones who know you or you've met before. Griff, maybe you haven't. Griff works with P2PU, so quite expert on peer learning stuff.
And Lorenz Salas here from the platform sutra.io. Howard, you might not have connected with Lorenz.
Hey,
Oh, Lauren is new to me. Hi, Lauren.
And Lauren, we spoke in regard to this Pravda DAO, you might recall, with Roland. So,
Yeah.
So do you also have Thursday calls, or is it just Wednesday now?
It's just Tuesday, actually.
Tuesday. Yeah, we did have something going on Thursdays with P2PU, but I think that's been somewhat superseded by dropping into these meetings as needed, at least while we're reading through this book. So yeah, the Griff and Nico had basically said it's great that you guys have written this book about peer learning. Not only can we use it, but we'd like to contribute to it. And so that's great. And yeah, I think a lot of the people here are hoping to contribute something to version 4 in some capacity. Yeah, we're just kind of working our way through the version 3 and giving it a good solid critique as well.
well, it started kind of innocently as a reading discussion group, but then it sort of morphed into this rabbit hole.
Right. Okay, well, I will continue to check in from time to time.
Great to
Grand.
have you here.
Talking about this resolution of the reduce and reuse pattern, the Rheingold U community is one of the examples, as far as I'm concerned, where one can reuse actually the community, which can be very temporarily united because there is a course, and then it stops because the course finishes. But what we saw was different attempts at various courses organized by Howard to continue the learning after the course actually finished. And that proved to be very difficult. And actually what we are having here is for the first time that, maybe not the first time, maybe there are other examples, but I think that the reading group model helped to keep part of the community alive, keeping, it's maybe sounding a bit dramatic like when I say it like that, but it helps to continue the learning. And maybe this could be also a kind of a pattern that online courses in general create these ad hoc communities, but whether or not a facilitator really incites people to continue afterwards, nothing prevents you from trying to unite some fellow learners and continue the learning afterwards.
say something?
Of course.
I don't know if I'm throwing this off track. I just kind of thought of a business model for Peeragogy.
Yes.
First of all, I went, you know, in my conversation with Dill, he explained pattern languages as something like this. You know, in my cookbook, it's like there's these basic salad recipes, like pesto shrimp salad, and it's just like basic, like here, what's the meat, what are the vegetables and seasoning, and the garnishes.
Yeah,
So,
that's exactly like Wikipedia explains patterns using a recipe.
yeah, exactly. So I was just thinking that say you might have like recipes kind of how you could put together kind of training programs or learning modules. And you could actually have, so you could see, you could kind of test which ones lead to what examples. Like, say, for example, maybe there are different ways to peer review. And maybe one of the methods of peer review is the most hardcore, like rigorous scientific method. So maybe you could get a university who wants their brand to be associated with rigorous academics to sponsor like a kind of a peeragogy accreditation into the development of this particular pattern. Like, for example, the Media Lab, they are really, they put a lot of money and effort into their brand, and their brand has to do with like interdisciplinary innovation.
Yes.
So you'd like maybe work with a university to say, okay, so what is the pattern that you use, and kind of develop that with them, and have like other institutions be able to adopt it, but associate the brand with that. Like, if you want something that's like MIT's Media Lab, this is a pattern you use to structure that.
And it would also almost be trademarked by MIT Media Lab. It would be the MIT Media Lab pattern for interdisciplinary collaboration, something like that.
Because I think that having that, like, you need some kind of, that's a lot of research and stuff to put together. Like, you need a real sponsor for putting these pattern language together. It's not so simple. But I just think that might be a way of actually getting some money into the space. And because that, something like that would strengthen their brand and also make them want to pay for research on how to make it happen. So it just wanted to throw that out there.
Cool.
It would be a kind of an explicit expert system, like when you ask experts to make it very explicit how they do what they do. And in this case, you would incite an institution to be as precise as possible about how they, for instance, manage to organize interdisciplinary collaboration. Yeah.
Would they have to trademark it though? That's a tough one. And maybe I don't know, I was playing with the idea of, you know, a digital plaque, like a watermark, or, you know, sort of actually having them own it. Would they have to own it? Maybe we could work it out where they didn't.
Well, clearly they couldn't like prevent someone from using the methodology, but I think that they could just putting it kind of together. I mean, I don't think they have to own it. and prevent, like enclose the methodology.
Yeah, well, the case of MIT is an interesting one there because they made their MIT open courseware, which is open, but it's also set on a license where it's non-commercial, I think. So you can use it, you can read it, you can download it from their website, but I can't go and take it and say, you know, this is Joe's class that I taught, and it's clearly someone else or whatever, because, you know, it's their stuff. There's openness with some controls in it. And I think those are interesting, in fact, really interesting relative to this. So I think that's a great suggestion. It's interesting relative maybe exactly to this pattern of reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Like we've got all these empty aluminum cans. Could we melt them down and sell the aluminum? I don't know, something like that. So how do we get value from this stuff, which we have a lot of, but we're not getting as much value from it as we maybe could. So I think that's a lovely suggestion. Keep suggestions like those coming. I'm sure there will be other cool ideas on the same plane as that one. But I do think that's who would want to sponsor this is a great question. And maybe it could be a consulting thing, and it wouldn't be about a ownership or a digital plaque, but they want to sponsor it as a like what you were saying, Roland, about building an expert system. That is something people pay for, and this is indeed kind of an expert system. So, yeah,
well, to kind of clean a bit of the karma, recent karma of their brand, potentially.
Yeah. So will we have a look at another pattern, the carrying capacity? See whether we have there some new ideas. Okay. That sounds very familiar, I think, for many people who are involved in these kinds of projects. The stresses to make the participants and the project itself more resilient. How do you communicate your stress in order to achieve that? There is only so much any one person can do, since we all have limited time and energy. Forces being anti-fragility and independence, where it's often impossible to delegate work to others. And then the typical challenges of over-promising, over-committing, and then crashing and burning. And then there is this reference to the buddy system. I don't know whether people here have any experience with this buddy system.
Sure, it comes up from childhood all the way. I mean, it's...
Yeah, that way. Okay.
I mean, it's pretty broad.
Yes, it's very broad, but I guess here it's really in the context of a, let's say, like the pedagogy project or the reading group project, where we do not typically, I think, at least not typically use this buddy system. We just come together and we do whatever we do, and there is no formalized system. There is, I can give one example where there is a buddy system, and which maybe not coincidentally is from a more, I don't know whether I can say it's religious, because it's a Zen Buddhist group which operates online. These guys are pretty serious, and they developed this buddy system because the practice involves that you meditate each day, for instance, and that you do certain other things which like helping the community, etc. But of course, people start out saying, well, I will do this each and every day. Seems a very lovely idea. And then, of course, life intervenes and it becomes more difficult to keep doing it. And then the buddy system is there to help people to talk about their challenges and experiences with a specific other member of the community, supporting each other. So in that context, it's rather formalized because they're not really force you, of course, but they really encourage you to find such a buddy. And one could imagine doing such a thing for other online projects outside of this more contemplative context.
Yes, that's true. I would say that there are certain times in the Peeragogy project where there has been a buddy system. It's not ubiquitous, but for example, like the book has 2 publishers, which is kind of funny. The Pub Dom Ed and Pierce Press, right? And so that at least kind of worked to have 2 different people working on the publication process jointly. But yeah, it hasn't been so formalized, and I think that this is one of the interesting things that someone was saying about how do you balance, Robert was saying this, how do you balance individual learning versus group learning, right? And I think that if you've got your own interests in something, maybe I'm interested in a specific programming language and no one else here is interested in that language, even if you're interested in programming, maybe not everyone is interested in programming. So this issue of finding the people with the closest compatible interests to work together, we're not very good at it yet, I don't think. And I think this is a good example of almost of an anti-pattern where, because we're not that good at it, we frequently run into difficulties and people continue to get burnt out. So we could get better at it.
There is an interesting example on this page about the view that there shall be no women in case there be not men, nor men in case there be not women, and the separate ladies' hall. But then saying that in light of the extreme gender imbalance in free software and the still striking imbalance at Wikipedia, it will be important to do whatever it takes to make women and girls welcome. Not least because this is important in order to boost or carrying capacity. So that's really in itself a kind of a chapter.
The charger for the bike? No. Is it gone?
Melanie,
Did someone take the charger to the bike?
I think it's more of like us misplacing things and not being organized.
It wasn't on the bike.
No, so
okay.
It would have been very obvious if it was on the bike. So
I was, maybe I jump in and call out Lorenz if you're still around. I was curious if you had any comments. I don't know. We talked about training modules earlier and a number of things. Actually, before you joined, about learning circles. I mean, there was some things that I think I don't know. You know, I don't want to speak for you, so I'll just open it up if you're into it, saying something.
Oh, you're asking Lauren.
Lorenz, but I see now he didn't make it this far. That's
Okay.
fun. Yeah, I was hoping. I Another time. It's okay. Excuse me.
Well, maybe you can broaden your question out. Maybe you can do a little, you said you don't want to speak for them, but maybe you could expand your question to those who are here.
Well, maybe, okay. So, I mean, so I put in, I'll put sutra.io. I just put that in the chat. So he's the founder developer. He wrote all the code. I just had a long catch-up call with him earlier. I known him for a while. Some of you know him, and essentially that platform is communication collaboration platform focused around small groups, deep engagement in small groups, and in particular for also for learning and training modules, and so he has a lot to bring, and I was glad that he showed up a bit in the midst of some traveling and stuff. He's also quite a proponent of the U process, U theory of Otto Scharmer, and he's a great facilitator. And actually, I just had my mind blown just earlier this evening in hearing some updated features, including mapping. So he's really bringing a lot, coming soon. So maybe I leave it at that and hope that his voice can come in again.
All right, cool. Yeah, we should hopefully learn more about that. Maybe when we get towards the technology section, we can set up a special guest edition or something like that. But you mentioned about learning circles, and I was just going to say that I mainly have heard about those from Griff in my life, so it's interesting to hear that coming through a different channel.
Yeah, the term that he uses on Sutra is circles. So you set up a circle, and it goes from there. But I'll be glad to help set that up when the schedule comes around.
Yeah. Okay. Looking at the next pattern being the specific project, it's a bit of a strange title in my humble opinion. Specific project. It's a pattern that can help participants to get started, to get focused, to make concrete change, and it is useful for someone who is currently feeling stuck. And I think the basics here is about asking a specific question to someone who may be able to help you get unstuck. And formulating that question can help your thinking to become more concrete.
So that's an interesting thing. The fact that you said that the title is wrong or the title is confusing is an interesting sign that maybe this needs a bit of excavation to think about what it's really trying to say. I think in a sense, this business about questions is interesting because
yes.
If you ask a very specific question and I tailor the question quite concretely, that can quite constrain the shape of the answer. It can maybe over constrain the shape of the answer. Yes. At the same time, if I don't include all the right context, we were talking about making salads. If I don't mention, that I'm a vegetarian, for example, then, someone tells me, well, you include shrimp in their salad, I'll be disappointed, right? So you have to get the context right. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that for now.
Yeah. And there also, the scrapbook is being mentioned here. That's another thing I find to be very interesting, this idea of the scrapbook. To make note of all the small things and weave them then back into your project roadmap. But I thought the scrapbook is also about abandoned abandoned inroads or abandoned sub projects, which you don't really want to throw away, but you want to archive it, so that maybe in another context it can become useful again. Or is that a wrong interpretation of what is being meant by scrapbook?
I was unfortunately typing in from before. I don't think there's anything wrong here, though. I'll just seize on that part. I think scrapbook is a quite underdetermined concept here. I mean, maybe the most relevant example is like we've got this big Google Drive of stuff in it going back to 2010 or 12 or whatever, and it's quite hard to navigate. So I think like maybe we would have to use like Foucault's ideas of the archive or something to say what we really mean by scrapbook, which could be quite theoretical. But
it's a bit like an attic where you put all kinds of stuff you don't want to eliminate, but you don't use it at that moment in time, so you keep it somewhere handy or not so very handy.
Yes, but also that you want to have a guide to that attic as well. So you'd have the attic, but you'd also have like a inventory and maybe a map for the attic, so you could find the things in it anytime. So yeah, that's a good image. Like, what would be your ideal attic design? That could be one thing. The image here that's actually used on the pattern is a path in a park, and it's a park inside Cambridge. So Cambridge is a very built up area, but they've got this park which isn't built up. So a lot of the concepts here are doing, sorry, I'm looking ahead to the scrapbook one. A lot of the concepts here are doing double or triple duty, and there are all these kinds of puns and metaphors and stuff like that. And maybe that's fun and useful, but it can be also quite confusing. So I think scrapbook and the other one talking about specific project are ones where it's almost infuriatingly in between several different meanings.
Yes,
I think. I'm noticing that there are probably quite a few people here who are sitting quietly, and that may be just a personal trait of being quiet or a sense of politeness or a sense of not having a whole lot to say. But I would welcome anyone who hasn't said anything for a while to take a moment and just say, have a minute to jump in if you're holding a thought. I think we're now just kind of bouncing around randomly. So if anyone's holding a thought, feel free to bounce it.
To the Google Drive, intrigued. I can't help being attracted to that endeavor of, I don't know, maybe we just talk more about it if I don't know what's the idea or the plan or the direction to improve the navigation as you were implying there, Joe.
I just realized if Melanie is still here, last time we talked, she was saying, this is something that she's very interested in, is to look at long-running projects and think about how they organize themselves, basically. And so this would be one that's kind of organized through disorganization. But yeah, it could be fun to have a whole scrapbooking day where we just look at this scrapbooking pattern and we do some of that stuff. But that's very much a separate issue to this reading group at the moment. But yeah, is it even that essential that we organize our old files? I don't think so. But at the same time, right now I'm working on starting to write a paper called
Sorry, I tried to stay away.
Peeragogy's greatest flops. So that where we're trying to look back in there at some of the worst failures and think about why they failed. So that's like an instance of the pattern.
One example?
Peeragogy's greatest flops.
One example of that?
Yes. One example of a flop. Uh, well, yeah, I think this is actually the document I shared with you earlier. I've started to work on there. So, when we tried to write this Knight Foundation proposal, it was a nice foundation, we have a nice proposal, but it didn't get funded, right? So a good example of a flop. Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh,
This
maybe.
is Sorry, this is Melanie. I just am on my phone, so I have to hit unmute to be able to speak, and I'm not on my computer. I am definitely interested in the patterning and the mosaic and the different piece that you're working on.
Can you
hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm also on my phone and also unmuting, but I will tag you in on that paper. That would be fantastic. So
Cool, thanks.
yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, to follow on from Joe's prompt about, I guess, quietness or not saying things. I was, although I'm very interested in pattern stuff, I actually wasn't able to stay up to date on the readings of, so I didn't really read the sections on pattern language this week. But so in not seeing the whole, I didn't want to sort of ask sort of, I don't know, naive questions that I could have had answered if I had have read it. But I was curious. It seemed like some of what we were pointing at was some of the patterns being maybe a little too generalized or meta. And from my conception of pattern language is this sort of container of a language is intended for sort of like fairly specific context or domain. As far as I know, like we're not really, well, in general, you're not exactly supposed to be trying to achieve sort of like a grand unified sort of pattern of everything language or something. So I'm curious, like what I don't know, in some ways, when I think of peeragogy or the space, something like learning circles comes to mind, and maybe that's sort of a small enough constrained context to work within. But then, yeah, in the same way that in one of my favorite sort of learning realms, collective intelligence, it's kind of like, well, almost anything could be seen as like collective intelligence, sort of. And so in a little way, like probably peer learning happens informally all the time and everywhere. So I'm curious if sort of you found a useful way to constrain sort of the context you feel you're sort of designing within.
So that's a lovely question. I just took notes on the newcomer thing, because although you're not a newcomer to this group, as you pointed out, you're a newcomer in a certain sense to this particular pattern catalog. And I think that there's a great value in having people who haven't read it talking to people who have read it, because you ask questions based on feeling like you don't know versus feeling like you have to know. So I love that question that you just asked, because I felt like that gets straight into this kind of issue of kind of what does it mean? What would it mean to know about this? But I would say the knowledge in my case, and this is an up-to-date statement about my thinking now, is yeah, it does happen everywhere, but it doesn't always happen very effectively. So it's not about becoming an expert on peer learning or modeling it, as you said, about a grand unified pattern of everything language. It's actually really a practical question about like, how can humans learn how to overcome the greatest difficulties that they face, and how can we help with that? And if this isn't practical and helpful for those issues, it's not relevant to the concerns that we actually have. So it is true that people do this stuff everywhere, but it would be the idea then to draw on this kind of deep, embodied, in many cases, knowledge that we have about learning and use it to address big challenges. And that's not really very transparent in what we've written here, because I think I've only really realized that for myself, like in the last 6 months or so. But that would be how I would talk about it now.
Just to
So
tag
this,
on,
that's right.
you know, Robert used the phrase collective intelligence, and I know discussed or you know mentioned this to a number of you, and I got this straight from Tom Atlee, who it wasn't Howard Lauren, it was Tom Atlee that used that example of the collective intelligence made the gas chambers in World War II. Tom Atlee refers to that, and so he likes to talk about collective wisdom, and I just thought I would put that in here as a kind of upgrade on the idea of intelligence would be actually wisdom.
Yeah, and I guess in a way, sort of, there's an overlap between intelligence as kind of just a raw potential for good or bad, in the same way that maybe pattern language is trying to solve a problem within a context that intelligence can sort of, yeah, solve almost any problem. It's just what problem are you putting your sort of potential towards.
Yeah, again, yeah, I think that's good stuff, and I think even as we were talking earlier in the reading group about how does the first few chapters of the handbook look, and how does it help people surface those issues and help people kind of address them and connect with other people who are working on related things. Maybe, you know, now that we're moved on a couple of weeks, it would be nice if that had all happened and it was all kind of starting to come together for readers at this point in the book. I'm not sure that we actually even hit the first of those milestones, but it's worth keeping in mind that had we done that at this point, maybe people would be using the pattern language to help connect with each other or whatever other objectives they might have had coming in there. So, so it's good to look back as well.
Yeah. Maybe let's have a look at the wrapper pattern, which I found rather inspiring because it incites us to have good informative resources and to create something very simple, maybe like a wrap-up summary. So in order to make activities comprehensible to people who may not have been following all of the details. And that's what I tried to do, sending my last email, more or less trying to give a brief overview of the things we have been discussing, so that also people who maybe did not participate in every meeting or could have an idea of what we are doing here. And it's something which the better MOOCs are doing also. Stephen Downes, for instance, has the habit of creating a newsletter specifically for his connectivist MOOCs, where because they are on a decentralized basis, and then it's even more necessary to have a kind of an overview of what is happening on different platforms. And I guess the same applies for pedagogy.
So I don't know if Howard is still on the call, but this seems like a very Howard level kind of thing to be able to follow many different conversations and many different threads. Yes. Without becoming imbalanced is something he's devoted a lot of effort to being able to do that and is able to do that. I don't remember where I put this comment in about kind of So I agree this wrapper pattern is a nice one. I made a critical comment somewhere. Yes, it is on this page. No, it's not. It was reminding me of some discussion we had about making the whole project accessible, which is something you just mentioned. And I was a little concerned that making something accessible is a bit similar to missionizing or proselytizing and sort of saying, oh, everyone should be doing things like we do in the Peeragogy project. And that's absolutely not what this is about. So it's tricky though, because if we're making these kind of wrap up things and sharing them, it kind of looks like that's what we're doing. So I feel that there's a very interesting tension between kind of missionary work and this particular pattern. And I think that tension is worth understanding better than I understand it right now.
Well, so some consequence of doing this and really giving open access to it is that you I think will create a group of lurkers following what you're doing. For instance, there are about 25 people now who asked one way or another to get the emails about the Peeragogy reading group. And most of them will not show up here, or almost never show up here, and even not, I think, respond in a mail or something else. But they showed interest. They just wanted to know what are you guys doing there. And I think there is a value in that, even when people do not necessarily come over and fully participate in the project, because this is the theory, I think, of the weak ties. It's quite possible that all of a sudden one of the weak ties realizes that we are touching on something which is highly relevant to their project, and then maybe they will make contact, and it maybe can be something very original, something which is of high value to us because it's a bit outside of our own thinking. So I think having these wrap-up summaries, but also saying that those summaries ideally should be shared as widely as possible, is very valuable. And I would not be too concerned about being missionary in that.
So maybe I would put it in the language that we were looking at with the specific project. It's not that we're sort of saying, here is the way you should do it. As you're saying, you can, it's very much saying, keep on doing what you're doing. If you're interested to join this kind of, to at least be aware of this kind of stuff, you can be aware of it. The value is kind of for us to be able to sort of put out our questions and maybe learn something from someone else's expertise without pushing them. And if it does happen to be the case that we sort of lead by example, and someone says, oh, I'm really interested in their example, then they come and kind of follow what we're doing for a while. That's interesting. But it could equally well happen that someone else will lead by example and we will follow them. So it's tricky though. I think that I do think it's perfectly valuable, and I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head of why. But I guess I just want to recognize, including to what Charles was talking about with his World War II example, that like, in a way I do, even though it seems like the most innocuous and least harmful thing of all, let's put it this way. Often people who say, there should be no hierarchies, everyone should be equal. Well, those people often will then go and become demagogues, and they say everyone's equal, but I'm the leader of these equal people or something like that. And so it is a position of responsibility to be the person who wraps things up and summarizes them. And you kind of have got to hold that responsibility, which I don't need to tell you this as a journalist, but you've got to hold that responsibility with a great deal of dignity and so forth. I mean, more than just dignity, but, because you're taking this responsibility for people who don't have the speaking stick at that particular point in time. So I don't know. It's a deep issue there, I think.
I think so, yes.
I would just give a big thanks and shout out to Roland for all of your work and energy, but also your really outstanding journalistic experience that you bring to bear on this role of rapping. And I think, you know, these wrap up notes, and I've seen it before in these other reading groups, you know, over a number of years already. You know, they're so great and so valuable in themselves. That I agree. I mean, I'm glad, you know, others think they should be shared widely as a resource in themselves. But and then further, they're also kind of holographic in the sense of, you know, with the embedded links and other resources, you know, within that. They mostly stand on their own. I mean, that's kind of, I'm going too far now, because there could be some of the context is not all there. Like I forwarded one of these to Lorenz earlier or yesterday or whatever, and then he was a bit confused until I clarified earlier on another call that the Google Docs was not the handbook itself, but actually, you know, the next version and so forth. So, but anyway, I digress. I think,
yeah,
you know, and just one more thought in this whole stream was in terms of the missionary aspect. I think, you know, the missionaries are motivated and thus they're well suited to that role. So, yeah.
Of course, one of the issues here is also privacy. For instance, I would like to put out some summaries on a personal blog, but then I would omit, I think, the links to the full videos, because people always disclose a bit more about themselves than they would necessarily want to do, knowing that literally anyone can just have a look at the video. And I think mostly of it's mostly innocent. I don't think anyone here is unveiling passwords or doing stupid things like that. But anyway, it is a bit more private, and so for that reason, I think there are different layers of accessibility. There is a difference between the people meeting regularly and those who are just passing by, having a look, what are those guys doing? And then maybe you don't want to unveil as much about your personal being than for people you meet about every week.
Yeah.
That's just a feeling I have.
And just to you know, Stefan Kreutzer, who was here or maybe still here in whatever forms, tends not to get on you know, group video calls, but does like to watch YouTube videos and really go through them and exhaustively and index them and all kinds of crazy stuff. Hopefully we'll get to hear from him directly at some point. But and he was emailing me. For example, I think the video from last week or whenever recently on YouTube is not listed, but it's also indicated as some Creative Commons, or I don't know. He was and kind of going off on this idea to maybe he'll just make his own version and index it. And
yes,
it was, you know, so I don't know. I just, maybe that's enough on Stefan at the moment.
Yeah. So what I do is I put the video, I record it on Zoom Cloud, and then in order to avoid some costs, I just put them on YouTube as unlisted videos and under a Creative Commons license. So yes. So maybe we should have a kind of a waiver there of giving people the opportunity to say, well, I really would not like these videos to be seen by many other people. Something so that they could, or they give the authorization to do so, or they can opt out. I don't know.
It's something
in
to
principle,
sort out. Yeah. Sorry, what was that, Roland? Oh, did he freeze again?
I'm just not sure about what to do with the videos. To be honest, at first I thought, well, let's the videos just be open and accessible. But then again, sometimes I think, well, maybe not everyone is feeling too comfortable with this idea. So,
yeah.
So having them unlisted is a bit of a kind of a in-between solution.
Yeah, I guess it's good at least if people know that. See, this is another feature of the wrapper is to kind of explain, you know how it works, and then just by participating, it's a kind of informed consent. But if you don't know how it works, then it's not really informed consent. So,
Lauren, did you? I was wondering. We went through a lot of this with the PKE. Did you have anything maybe to add there?
Yeah, I can try to find. Sophie had something, a recommendation of a woman who spent a lot of time dealing with consent. She's like an expert. I can get the name if anyone wants it.
Okay. It could be interesting.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that the other thing we talked about with this wrapper issue is we were talking about the early sections of the handbook being about helping people kind of identify the problems that they're working on and figuring out an approach to that. So the whole book has this kind of pattern-ish feel of identifying problems, if you want to use that language or whatever. But this issue of consent is an interesting example because it's, as we're saying, that should be part of this wrapper, part of the boundary that you interact with when you're coming into something. So I don't know. It seems like it has to gel a bit with this identifying of problems. I mean, maybe one of the problems is what ethical concerns could come up.
Mm-hmm.
People should be prompted to ask that, for example.
There's a very different pattern is the heartbeat. That's really a nice name for giving a certain rhythm to whatever people are doing. It's a pulse. It can be once a day, once a week, or once a year even. And it's said that a well-running project will feel like an improvisational jazz ensemble. And I think that's very true, that it really helps groups to keep functioning, even when people don't have each and every week the opportunity to attend a meeting, for instance. Just knowing that it takes place, that it's there, that others will meet, gives a kind of a coherent or consistent feeling that something is alive there. And of course, there can be more than just one heartbeat, I think. So we were thinking about, it has been mentioned today, the federated wiki stuff, going in depth in wiki and pattern relationship. If you, maybe not everyone is that interested to go into the gory technical details of building a federated wiki, but if some people of the group can do this, eventually working with external people who are maybe not that interested in the pedagogy in itself, but who are interested in setting up servers and stuff like that. Well, that can be a kind of an additional heartbeat. Maybe those people will meet every 2 weeks or every day for a limited time in order to get it up and running. And so you would have various rhythms in around the same project.
Since Rob Best left the call now, I think I would just flag him because
Yes.
yeah, we've been talking about that, and hopefully that'll happen in some form at some point, sooner than later.
Yeah, so it's too bad he left because I was thinking I might spend a few extra minutes discussing with him because he'd asked me about peer learning in mathematics, which is something that's pretty near and dear to me. But I will just have to set that up with him as a separate one-off call. But that would be an example of the kind of thing that maybe we don't bore everyone with something if not everyone's interested specifically in mathematics. We could work it in. Okay. Yeah, I think this is a deep one. I think, Roland, you raised the question below about the example of the farm. It needs more explanation. I was just saying more explanation could be maybe more discussion. And, I grew up on a farm, and it's like the idea of a season and the relationship of the season to life is something that I take seriously because I grew up on the farm for the first 10 years of my life. And at the same time, I think, maybe, I would personally probably be a bit critical or tend to poo-poo, efforts to build communes, or I've heard of things like secular monasteries and stuff like that. But maybe some of them are good to learn from, and maybe they work different for different people. But I felt like this particular example too is possibly a really interesting kind of way into the whole book. So I wanted to talk more about it. Just that, like, I think part of this example too is about how do we exist sort of in harmony with nature, or like in harmony with our own personal nature. And I think that does definitely get lost here inside of example 2. It doesn't really say that, but I actually think that that's an interesting question.
Yes.
As a way into the whole topics in the handbook. Yeah.
I think it would be relevant, yes. Then talking about the newcomers, which is yet another pattern, which is a very deep pattern, I think. There is this reference, the motivation, saying that this pattern can help project participants to be aware of the issues faced by newcomers and cultivate a beginner's mind themselves. The beginner's mind, I guess, refers to what is called in Zen Buddhism Shoshin. Which actually is a kind of incites you to try to look at things from a fresh perspective without all kinds of presuppositions, which is easily said but rather hard to do. But it's nice that this is coming up here in this pattern about what to do with newcomers who will invariably feel overwhelmed by all the stuff happening in that group, and they don't know about it. They don't know where to start. And so the recommendation being in this pattern to focus on newcomers as being us.
I guess that's using this Zen idea as the core of the solution, right? But this is what I was saying is different between peeragogy and a provisionist style of peer learning. That, like, and this, I think we all probably always forget about this every time we're talking about newcomers. So we've been talking, for example, do we need an onboarding pattern for new people? But this is really saying, this solution, anyway, to the extent that we believe it, this is saying, let's not be provisionist. Let's not even have an onboarding pattern. Let's look at what we're learning and how this circumstance is new for us. maybe that's true. Maybe we believe it and maybe not. I don't know if we really believe it, but to the extent we believe it, yeah, we should be clear what it's saying, and maybe, yeah, just be honest with ourselves. If this doesn't work, then maybe we need an onboarding pattern. Anyway, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Lauren, we talked a lot about onboarding in another context.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I suppose I could say something too, but
Do
Lauren,
so.
I know you.
Do so by all means.
I think it's a major area, and maybe it's case by case. I mean, are we going meta again and talking about peeragogy, or that's in general? We just need a pattern that would be widely applicable. I kind of
so the way we would do it, I think, implementing Griff's earlier suggestion is to ask you to explain about the other context you were talking about and learn from that.
Lauren, over to you. If you want or not.
Yeah.
No, maybe.
No, I don't have anything to say.
Well, okay. So what I'm referring to is has to do with the DAOs and this particular platform called DAO Stack. But it's the only one I have any experience with. I guess there are probably similar issues in other DAO platforms in regard to onboarding, sort of, accessibility of entry. I don't know what to say, but it's been a huge discussion over quite a lot of time, and amongst our sort of small huddle as well as the community at large. There are in this one community and with regard to this one platform, there are probably at least a dozen or dozens potentially of assorted articles and roadmaps and guides and videos, and I mean, it's just like a total I don't know. There's some really good efforts, but the filtering of all of these, I think they're probably evolving as they iterate. It's not all the same people, but anyway, I hope that I'm making some sense in painting a picture of a quite a crowded landscape, both in terms of the rate and volume of this discussion, or around this question of onboarding, but also the plethora of attempts at simplifying and streamlining it, but it all adds up to a bunch of clutter, maybe. So there you go.
Yeah. And so maybe you do need a kind of a rather formalized onboarding procedure, protocol.
Well, yeah, maybe, and to further confound it, I mean, the example is decentralized autonomous organizations. So supposedly there's no sort of central authority, which is actually not true. But as a result, sort of anything goes, and anyone can come forth and have a go at it, which is a good thing, and it's a double edge,
But actually what you need would be a kind of an introduction saying, if you have 15 minutes, we'll explain you in 15 minutes what it's about and what you can do. But if you have 1 hour, we will explain you more in depth. But that it would be a kind of canned repository or of things where a newcomer can just say, okay, I have 15 minutes, I will go for that one, or no, I really want to know more, I will take the 1 hour sequence. And then they still can do whatever they want. They have all those other resources. If they want to look around for themselves, they can do so, of course. But they would have the kind of,
every week there's a new resource coming, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So there has to be a kind of minimum viable introduction.
So this reminds me of two things. One is two patterns. I mean, one is the scrapbook where we talked about, yeah, just making sense of such a big archive of materials.
Yes.
And the other, actually, I think when we talked about specific project, if I remember correctly, at one time that was actually called minimum viable project. So the idea
Yes.
would be, and this may depend, of course, on the individual, what makes it viable for them or not. But, you know, it sort of doesn't matter if there's loads and loads of materials, as long as you can find the right material for the person when they're coming along, or if that person can find the right material for them. If they come with a question, that's their project. And if they then leave in disgust because they haven't gotten enough help or enough clues about how to address their problem, it's not a viable project. If they suddenly get enough help and clues and they feel they've overcome that difficulty, then it is a viable project. So I don't know. It just seems like, yeah, some of the stuff we've been talking about here is relevant to those concerns, I guess.
I don't know whether yeah, please go ahead.
So just to add, you know, in practice, what the sort of immediate community, the sort of inner circle, word of mouth or you know, immediate recommendation or referral, like points me to like this one seems to work the best. So at this point, kind of thing. So that's where it's at. That's all I want to add. Sorry, Roland.
I was wondering whether the minimum viable project is a pattern in itself and whether it should be included then in the list of patterns.
Well, it is mentioned in my thesis. I'm just thinking that evolved into specific project just from a terminology standpoint. So we could look back and see whether maybe they are two separate ones. I can't remember. I think people really didn't like the minimum viable project one for some reason, but I don't quite remember the discussions about it. But it doesn't mean it couldn't be brought back.
Yeah, it's on in the attic.
Is there a link or reference, Joe, to where that's described?
Oops. Sorry, it's in my thesis someplace, so I can add that.
At some point, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, me too. So we are nearing the end of the session, I think, and we are all pretty tired by now. At least I am. But I see there is still the pattern of the scrapbook, and we talked a lot about scrapbook. So maybe it's would be interesting to have a look at that one before we leave it. The scrapbook describes a way to make the project meaningful. And the meaning is about shared history, which makes things meaningful. Not all of the ideas we've come up with have been proved workable. Not all of the patterns are equally relevant. And so in order to maintain focus, it is important to tune and prune the things we give our attention to. And then there are questions which we should ask, such as review what was supposed to happen, establish what is happening or what happened, determine what is right and wrong with what we are doing. What did we learn or change? What else should we change going forward? That's a kind of a review process or a post-mortem in theater and other teamwork. And anything that isn't receiving active attention should be moved to a scrapbook. And there we have the scrapbook. And the scrapbook may encompass retired patterns, proto-patterns made of problems, issues, and concerns, and the back catalog of publications, reports, and other artifacts. And I don't know whether we have a link to the that would be interesting, I think. I would be interested in
a link to what?
To the scrapbook, actually, the Peeragogy scrapbook.
Well, that's a good question if there even is one. I mean, like I said, there's this Google Drive.
Yes, scrapbook.
Maybe is there one? I think our clever answer was that the Peeragogy Handbook is the scrapbook as well, but I can't remember. Maybe that's too clever. Yeah. I don't know I don't know quite what the right answer is. Do we have a Peeragogy scrapbook? Do we have a Peeragogy scrapbook?
Maybe you can make a section within the drive to sort of dump the scraps. That might be useful. I had something to add. I know it's getting late, but this resonates with me in a kind of reverse direction in a way. In other words, like for myself, well, so there's a phrase that comes to mind, which is like landing stage or landing page, that I use a lot in my maps or I use Microsoft OneNote, and there could be a sort of a page a kind of pre-scrapbook, in other words, to put resources or other materials in a pre-stage before sorting. So I don't know where that sort of sticks and fits here, but that's what I'm thinking here.
Hey guys, I gotta go.
Okay,
Right.
thank you so much for being here.
Letting me come.
Nice to meet you. I hope to see you again at another one of these
Meet you
things
too.
sometime.
Bye.
Cheerio.
Bye.
Bye.
So did that make any sense, guys? I don't know. Maybe we should wrap it up, but
Yeah, it does make sense.
I mean, landing stage, or I use that phrase just in my own notes and maps a lot. Just landing, just as a place to. I mean, it sort of can go back and forth, and it in a loop almost. Like everything comes from somewhere, and so I have this place to put it, and then it gets sorted from there. So it's like a intermediate.
Yeah, but the landing page is something very different in my view from a scrapbook.
Well, it's just the sense, I think landing stage might be a more appropriate term here, not to confuse with like a web page, homepage, but
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're reminding me of this, like getting things done method of dealing with incoming information, which I don't really understand that well. The guy who developed that went to my same undergrad, but many years before I was there. But yeah, there's this kind of information processing workflow of which the scrapbook would be part of it. And maybe it doesn't mean that much if it's not in this broader context of some other information flow. I agree.
I mean, in other words, it's not just the cutting room floor, but it's the sort of the bed for a new garden, or whatever you want to say.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we close it there, we'd be in a really interesting position, because having been through most of these patterns, but not yet coming to the distributed roadmap, if we cut it here, we could stop now before, I guess we're all in Europe at various time zones, before we all fall asleep. Well, most of us are in Europe right now anyway. Cut it here, and then we could begin with this distributed roadmap, and that would connect nicely for those who were here. And if anyone come along who didn't attend this session, they'd still get a nice overview of everything we did discuss. So that could be fun.
Yay.
Nice.
I will stop the recording now.
Thank you, Ron.
Stop the recording.